From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. For journalists at the Sunday Times, there's a great pride in all the scoops and stories that the paper's broken in its long history. The campaigns that changed the country, the investigations that held governments to account, and then there are the stories that were chased but never quite landed. The investigations that remain unsolved. One of the most enduring mysteries that's haunted the paper involved one of its own star reporters, and it took place in the dying days of 1977.
David Holden was the end of a 10-day swing through the Middle East, reporting on some very important political events, the rapprochement or move to peace between Israel and Egypt. He was the chief foreign correspondent of the Sunday Times. He was also writing for the New York Times at the same time, so he was very much at the top of his game, respected, accomplished, all these adjectives apply to him. And on that trip, he was flying from Amman, the capital of Jordan, into Cairo quite late at night in order to do the final stage of reporting, start the following morning. We know that on that flight he was in an absolutely foul mood. The flight was late, he was held up by some American tourists, the food was awful, he was worn out, he was worried about where he was going to stay, he wasn't sure whether he had a hotel booking that night. He was going to arrive in the city at 11 o'clock at night, and not knowing where he was going. So he was off to a bad start. When the flight landed at Cairo airport, he sets off through some very echoing, concretey corridors. I've made that trip several times myself at that time. Then he goes to retrieve his luggage. He picks that up, heads through the customs, through the nothing declared channel, and goes out into the exterior part of the arrivals building. It's a clammy night, even though it's December. There's a smell of dust in the air from a dust storm which has swept through Cairo 24 hours before. Off to the left is the place where you go to get a regulated official taxi into Cairo. And that's where you'd have expected him to go, but he didn't. Somewhere, he was intercepted and steered towards another group of cars to the right of the regulated taxis. And a lot of those cars were very old, battered second-hand, and he, as we later deduced, is driven off in one of those. That's the last time anybody saw Holden alive. What we know is that he was driven around for several hours in one of those cars. Then he was shot from the back through the heart. One shot kills him. His body is then driven to a roadside outside an industrial complex up near the airport, and it's dumped there, probably at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. At dawn, some students are waiting for a bus and they see his body lying in the dust. And it's taken to the local mortuary, well, the main city mortuary, and it lies there for 3 days until it's identified.
"48 years later, one of David's colleagues who first investigated his murder teamed up with a young journalist at the Sunday Times to finally solve the mystery. Who killed David Holden? The story today, Murder in Cairo, Part 1.
I'm Peter Gillman. I was on the staff of the Sunday Times in the 1970s under the great editorship of Harry Evans, one of the all-time stars of journalism. And I was on something called the Insight Team, which is investigative unit. In that period, I spent 5 years there. And the toughest and biggest and most disturbing story of all that we worked on was the case of the murder of David Holden in Cairo in 1977.
You were the crack team of investigators on Fleet Street, and yet the biggest mystery was in your own office.
Yes, we thought we were good. We thought we would crack anything, and this is the one that we didn't. One of the most disturbing things of all was some of the leads that we were following led right back into the Sunday Times office.
What was the office like back then?
The office itself, compared to today's offices, is a bit of a slum. Just remember, we worked on manual typewriters, no word processors, no computers, no mobile phones, no internet. It was a great place to work, though, even despite all the cigarette smoke. There's a great camaraderie there. It was a fabulous place to be. I described it as one of the great adventures of journalism, being on the Sunday Times in that period.
And as you said, the Sunday Times at the time had a legendary, a very inspiring editor, one of the greats. Tell us a bit about him.
Harry Evans was one of the great editors of his time. He was a northern boy. He'd edited the Northern Echo before coming to the Sunday Times. One of his great gifts that the journalists respected him most for was that he respected the journalists in turn. He trusted them. And if you said you thought you knew what a story was, he would believe you.
What was his reaction like when it dawned on him that one of his reporters was dead?
Well, he was stunned. He was startled. He was in a room in a nearby hotel where he often stayed on a Saturday night after waking very late to see the newspaper to bed. He got the call, rushed back to the office. His very first instinct, the journalist instinct, was to prepare a report. He went on the front page saying, "David Holden killed." Very brief, saying he'd been missing and now his body had been found. And so the first instinct was, what do I put in the newspaper? The second instinct is, what happens next week? How are we going to cover this? And he then sent a team of 6 journalists to the Middle East right away to start piecing together what Holden had done in that last trip. I was sent to Amman, the capital of Jordan, I think on the Monday.
Before we get into the investigation and what you found, just explain, what was the backdrop to this awful murder? What was David Holden out reporting on? What was happening in the Middle East?
It was an absolute crucial time in the Middle East. Remember that the Middle East nations were effectively in a state of war with Israel ever since it was founded in 1948.
This is the very limit of the territory that Israel occupies in the Sinai. Behind me is the UN post, which marks the beginning of the buffer zone, and 5 miles to the west are the Egyptians.
But what happened in 1977 was that Egypt's President Sadat decided it was time to make some kind of move towards peace with its neighbour, its Jewish neighbour. A lot of the push came from the Americans and Secretary of State Kissinger, so the power politics were very, very important indeed. And it was a stunning reversal of everything we thought we knew about Middle East politics.
The man sent out to cover this, the chief foreign correspondent, David Holden, the man who ends up dead by the side of a road in Cairo. Tell us about him. What was he like?
The truth is, I don't know, and not many people did. I only met him once in all the time I was there. I remember I was at a leaving party for somebody in the foreign department, and he walked past me and just gave me a little glance, and our eyes met. And I was wondering whether this was going to go anywhere, but it didn't. His eyes switched back and then he walked off. That's my single contact with him. And what we found is a lot of people who we thought knew Holden didn't. They said he was very hard to get to know. Someone called him a charming enigma. You thought you knew him, and then when you looked, it's a bit like the end of the rainbow. You never quite got there.
How intriguing. Tell us what his obituary said.
His obituary, at first sight, was pretty much what you expect. He was the son of a newspaper editor from Sunderland. He went to Cambridge University during the war. He studied geography, qualified to be a teacher. He had a time as a teacher which he didn't enjoy. He had trained to be an actor. He then went to university in the United States, in Northwestern University near Chicago, and then he got himself a job on the Times. And from there, it was quite a speedy ascent on the Times. He was promoted very quickly. He also wrote books and he appeared on television.
I don't think there's any reasonable way of making the oil more secure. We can't really maintain troops on every oil field in the Middle East. It simply isn't on anymore. I think we can be less dependent on it, most of all through the development of the new oil fields that have been discovered, the very big ones, for instance, in the Sahara and in Libya.
So he was an all-round performer and, from a distance, a respected journalist and commentator.
When you were dispatched as part of a team, you're sent out to all the different places he had been in the last week of his life. What did you learn about what he'd been up to?
We mostly found the stuff you'd expect of a foreign correspondent to do. He was meeting diplomats. He went to some press conferences. He went out on the ground in the occupied West Bank and talked to Palestinian leaders about what the Israelis were doing. It was pretty standard stuff, and he worked very hard. He had a very full itinerary. He did meet other journalists. We've learned quite a lot from the journalists he met and had lunch and dinner with. He was quite convivial. They said he seemed to be in quite good spirits. There were some anomalies. There were a couple of afternoons that we couldn't fill. We could never work out what he'd done in two particular places in the trip. That's one thing that intrigued us. The thing that impressed us at the end of that first stage of the inquiry was someone very badly wanted him dead. And we based that judgment on what you might call the methodology of the killing. He'd been taken away in a battered Fiat car from Cairo airport. That turned out to have been stolen. Thieves had stolen it. They resprayed it. They stole a second car, also resprayed. And it turned out there was a third car that had been stolen about 4 weeks before. So there were 3 cars which were stolen, 1 4 weeks before, indicating they were planning for this for a long time. The other 2 were stolen maybe at most 48 hours before he arrived in Cairo, showing they knew he was coming. This was a serious operation planned by people with big facilities in Cairo, and the lengths they went to ensure they killed him showed it was a very serious operation indeed.
This isn't just something that was an opportunistic killing. This isn't something that just happened randomly. There's something behind it.
We had some gaps, 2 afternoons in particular, where we couldn't work out what he was doing. Then into one of those gaps came a story from a Palestinian academic we met who said that he had been with Holden that afternoon in the West Bank, a long way away from the old city of Jerusalem. And he told quite an elaborate story of what Holden and he had been discussing. The trouble is that didn't match with anything else we knew. Another journalist who'd also met this man said that he never mentioned Holden. Holden never mentioned seeing this man. So it began to look to us as if this man had actually constructed an alibi for the time when Holden was doing whatever secret stuff he was doing in the old city.
And you thought he was in the old city of Jerusalem at the time?
We think he was, and we have a reason for saying that. Jan Morris, former Middle East correspondent, formerly James Morris, received a postcard from him, which was sent from the old city that afternoon, and it had this inscription: "In the Middle East, citadels still have their uses." And it showed a fortress on the city walls, I think known as King David's Fort. And we puzzled over this, and so did Morris. We couldn't work out what it was.
So intriguing. Tell us about some of the people he was meeting during those last few days.
There was an American journalist called Michael Elkins who met Holden on his way to Cairo, and he questioned him very, very closely about when he was going, where he was going to stay. And Holden himself was very disturbed by that and actually deflected the questions by telling Elkins he wasn't even sure he was going to Cairo, let alone when he was going to go. One of his most interesting encounters, at least as it was told to us, was with an American couple called John and Isabel Fistier, who saw him in his last evening in Amman. They were near the Intercontinental Hotel, and they said he was in a great hurry to catch his flight. He was trying to send a telex to Cairo to see if he could confirm his hotel booking. They talked to him very briefly. He was very flustered, short-tempered, and it was a very short encounter before he then rushed off to get to Amman. Someone else told an entirely different story about when Holden had been at the Amman Intercontinental checking his flights and getting ready to leave, and that was by the Emanuele Rana travel agency. He saw them with the Visteers and said it was that afternoon around 2:30, not 6:30 in the evening as the Visteers had said. So those are one of the puzzles we have to deal with. Who do we believe? Do we believe the seemingly disinterested travel agent? Do we believe the Visteers? It was something which became a very powerful element in our findings and also our theorising.
At the end of this first week, where you're chasing up all these leads, you're trying to work out, reconstruct exactly what happened to him, in those few days, you come back with gaps and suspicions, nothing concrete yet. And the Sunday Times splashes the news on the front page. Tell us about that.
At the end of the first week, it was absolutely frantic. The Sunday Times assembled a story which related everything we found, as well as the backstory of his life. It was a piece about guessing. It canvassed a range of theories as to why he might have been killed. Was it a robbery that went wrong? Was it maybe a terrorist demonstration of some kind? Was it even a love tryst that had gone badly wrong? And there was also a theory that he'd been killed by Israel in revenge for some articles the Sunday Times had printed revealing Israeli torture of Palestinian prisoners. It laid out that speculation but came nowhere towards concluding that that was actually the last piece the Sunday Times wrote about it for decades.
Peter, in late 1977, the editor of the Sunday Times, Harry Evans, sent you out to what was already a dangerous patch to try and reconstruct the last days of David Holden's life. You went to Amman in Jordan. You'd managed to establish that this was clearly a planned murder. There had been a strategy in place for weeks. What happened next?
We all came home from the first trip just before Christmas, and then in the New Year we regrouped. We clearly had more questions than answers at that point, and Harry said, OK, I want two of you to go back and do the whole thing all over again. I want you to go to all the places Holden went, cover all the bases, recover them, talk to old people, talk to new. So he sent myself and a colleague called John Barry, and we went to those cities that he'd been to, Beirut, Amman, Damascus, and Cairo.
And in that second trip, did you start to learn more about some of those gaps that you couldn't account for?
We began to work out now that there was an intelligence world that we were getting into. Maybe we were a little naive not to suspect that straight away, but what we couldn't work out yet was what part David Holden had in all that. And then came a moment, an event, which told us things were getting very serious indeed.
What was that?
I was in Beirut when we got a very troubled message from the London Sunday Times office. We didn't get many phone calls because it was so hard to call, either to or from any of those Middle East countries, but the message we got was to this effect. There was a thief at the Sunday Times. Someone was stealing the messages that John Barry and I were sending back to London about what we were finding and more troubling about our travel plans. Someone was following what we were doing. That was the first disturbing thing.
And you were sending these back by telex back then?
These are messages which are typed at one end and are printed out at the other along an old-fashioned telephone line.
And those messages were going missing?
They were being stolen. Someone had stolen them. Now it gets worse. They then checked back over some of the old material they'd had, particularly relating to Holden, and now realised that some of his telexes, in particular telexes concerning his own travel plans, had also been stolen. The Sunday Times stepped up all its security preparations, precautions. It locked all the offices, and then another theft occurred of more of my travel plans, despite all the precautions they'd taken. So this showed that someone very serious indeed wanted to know what John Barry and I were doing. It showed us that the waters we were getting to were getting very deep indeed, very murky. We now knew that the people who appeared to be our opponents were very serious indeed.
And they had links back to the newsroom. And what did you find out about David Holden himself?
What happened next was that Harry said, OK, we're going to press on. You still don't know who did it. You're now going to have to broaden the whole investigation. Look at the whole of Holden's life. What there is in his life that led to his death. What was he up to? What was he doing? Who did he meet? What was he really about? What was behind this enigma? And so from that moment, the inquiry broadened to take everything from his birth in London in 1924 to his death 53 years later in Cairo.
And what did you learn?
There were some key findings, which didn't all add up, but they were troubling. We felt he clearly had been of interest to British intelligence at some point. We thought they made an attempt to recruit him while he was at Cambridge. And we think they wanted to send him to Czechoslovakia, which was a standard method they used, and then to work there as a teacher, get himself acquainted there. That fell through, but he was still started to work as a teacher, and that was a standard thing they did when they were preparing agents. So that fitted that. Then the second question was, how was he promoted so quickly at the Times? He rose from being someone who just wrote a speculative letter, that's the story, saying, can you give me a job, to someone who finds himself in Washington 3 months later as one of its 2 Washington correspondents. And when we looked into the credentials of the background of the people who had hired him, we thought they had links with British intelligence. We think he was involved with the CIA to some extent, although the nature of that extent was something which puzzled us.
Tell us about that. In what way was he?
One of the things about David Holden was that he was normally a very kind of cautious and rather wry observer of events, and he was normally quite positive, but totally out of keeping with some pieces he wrote, some for a British intellectual magazine called Encounter, which later proved to have been backed by the CIA, delivering absolutely savage attacks on some of the CIA's most determined opponents, in particular Fidel Castro of Cuba and Salvador Allende of Chile. He wrote pieces about them which were from the CIA script. These were villains, these were despots, had to be brought down. And it was so out of keeping that he should write propaganda pieces. That got us wondering. He also had a remarkable propensity for being in the right place at the right time. When a coup was going down, when a civil war was brewing, he was there, and it happened time and time again. But one of the most curious things of all was he also knew what time he should get out. He was in Santiago de Chile before Allende was deposed, most likely with CIA involvement, and he left just in time. One of the most dramatic times was when he was in Uganda, when a man called Milton Obote was taking over, and there was a very brutal coup going on. And the photographer Don McCullin told us a story of how, again, Holden had left 24 hours ahead of the thing going wrong.
I was in Uganda during Idi Amin's reign, and there was a man called David Holden who left. And a couple of days later, I realized why he fled, because he knew there was a coup coming across the Tanzania border. And that night, Idi went mad, and I was grabbed with 4 other journalists and taken to the military prison. And the first thing we got was a good evening indoctrination by a good hiding and whipping and kicking, and put into what they called the VIP cells.
McCullin told us how he and McCullin had been arrested, dumped in a cell, seen people beaten to death in front of him, and he was incensed that Holden had walked out on him and hadn't given him the same warning.
And you mentioned that he had clearly written a few pieces for a magazine backed by the CIA, taking a very CIA line. Did you speak to the CIA at the time? Did you try to find out if he was working for them, or?
Did we ask the CIA if David Holden was working for them? Yes, we did, or at least we tried to.
How did that go?
It was just a long dance, a kind of manufactured quadrille of where they would pretend to be helpful and they weren't. And they would say, we'll see if we can help you, we'll look into this, we do all we can. And they said, we've got nothing to see here. We then found out from a source of our own that the CIA did have a document about Holden. We weren't sure what it said, but since they denied having anything, we thought we'd better see this, or try to see it. And the Sunday Times in the United States took the unprecedented step of suing the CIA for access to that secret document that we knew they had.
Wow.
And the CIA refused to show it. We appealed, and the appeal went to a judge in Washington, and he took one look at the documents and said, these are much too sensitive to release to public view, and we never saw them.
So at this stage, you know the CIA knows a lot about David Holden that they're not telling you. You know David Holden was certainly approached and seems to have had links to British intelligence. He definitely had links to the CIA. What more did you learn about his private life and some of the characters there?
There was one relationship that we came upon that seemed to us to hold the key to an awful lot. It was with an academic called Leo Silverman, whose family came from South Africa, a family of South African Jews, who had lived and worked in Britain for a time before the Second World War. And at some point, we think in 1949, 1950, he met Holden. We're not quite sure how, but what we do know is that he was gay, Holden was gay, and the two had a secret affair that lasted for 10 years. We knew that because Silverman's brother told us, and he was quite specific about it. So suddenly it opens a vista into Holden's sexuality. At that time, homosexuality or homosexual behaviour was illegal, so that's one reason to be secret about it. We know that they were close. When Holden, he decided after giving up teaching that he wanted to go and study in America. He went there and Silverman followed him to America and got a job at the university where Holden was studying.
Crossed continents for him.
And then the thing gets even deeper and more mysterious because we discover that Silverman has got sympathies, links with the Soviet Union. And we discovered a secret trip they made together to Mexico City, where there is notorious as being a KGB recruiting base. And we began to think that maybe Silverman recruited Holden into the KGB.
Wow.
If true, that was devastating. Silverman was a liar, an imposter, a con man. He claimed to have done a lot of things that he hadn't. He claimed, for example, to have a doctorate from Balliol College, Oxford, and he had almost no connection with Balliol College, apart from having failed to get a job there. And this is the man who Holden is closely involved with for 10 years. You've got the actor and the imposter together. And what it added up to, at that first stage, we could only speculate.
You now have layers of intelligence intrigue. You have links to the British intelligence, to the CIA, and potentially even the KGB.
Yes.
At that point, having spent a good year looking into it, were you any closer to knowing who had murdered David Holden?
At the end of almost a year, Harry Evans was getting quite impatient. He wanted us to write it. And in the end, I did. And I wrote a 30,000-word report summarising everything we had. And the two questions, who killed Holden and why, were the ones I addressed. By that time, we were fairly certain about the who, because we thought the people best placed to have mounted that very elaborate, complex operation of stealing cars, hijacking Holden, driving him from one car, killing him in another, making the getaway in a third. The people best placed to do it were the Egyptians themselves. Now, why did they do it? Any number of reasons we were considering, but we knew by now that we were into some pretty deep waters. But in terms of the why, all we could put down was the evidence we had of his links with different intelligence agencies, the British, the Americans, the CIA, the Russians, the KGB. We put them there and said essentially, dear reader, you decide. And the dear reader was actually Harry because it was for his eyes only. But we said there's this speculative stuff. The best thing we can tell you, he was in intelligence game. He was possibly involved with more than one intelligence agency. If he was working with two, that gave you possibilities of treason and betrayal. And we think that he was killed for some reason within that.
And this wasn't published, this was just for the editor?
It was written for the editor. I think the idea was it would be the basis of some articles. But by a terrible irony, the Sunday Times at that time was closed. It was closed for a whole year because of a battle to the death between the owners, the Thompson Company, and the print unions over the introduction of new technology. And so there was no newspaper to publish it in. Harry left the Sunday Times not long after all this, after it was taken over by Rupert Murdoch and he was moved to the Times. I left the Sunday Times about that time, but I carried on for a time on my own bat, and I pursued my own inquiries for a while, and I found bits and pieces that were adding to that picture. So I stayed with it for quite a long time.
And Harry Evans, even though he left the Sunday Times, this was the story that he couldn't quite let go of either.
He couldn't let go of it at all. I met him twice the year before he died, and he said, "Peter, I'm still troubled. We never got to the bottom of Holden. I want to see it through. Are you up for it?" And I said, yes, I was. And then the second time, I saw him at another reception 3 months later, and he still said, "Peter, it's the thing that troubles me most. We never saw it through, and it's the greatest regret of my career." That's my last conversation I had with him before he died.
It was a mystery that needed to be solved. Tomorrow, in part 2, after the death of Harold Evans, a reporter from the current Sunday Times newsroom picks up the investigation.
It's the kind of story that got me into journalism in the first place. The greatest advantage of the new investigation was that we had all this access to all these documents, all this material, which is something that Peter never had.
With new leads to follow, the team uncover a tangled web of links between journalism and the murky world of espionage. And it soon becomes clear that in the old Sunday Times newsroom, it was hard to know who to trust.
I had no idea how many journalists thought it was okay for them to double as spies, and I didn't realise the Sunday Times itself in the 1950s had been recruiting people to be journalists and spies simultaneously.
That's all in part 2 tomorrow. In today's episode, you heard from Peter Gillman, a former member of the Sunday Times Insight Investigations team, and, briefly, from the Times and Sunday Times investigative reporter Emanuele Midolo. Peter and Emanuele's book, Murder in Cairo, is available to pre-order now from the Times bookshop, and if you're a Times Plus member, you do get 20% off. We'll put a link to it in the description of this episode. And there'll be more on this story at thetimes.com, which is free to access this weekend. The producer today was Edward Drummond, the executive producer was Kate Ford, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Assetto. If you can, please do leave us a review wherever you get this podcast, or pass it on to somebody who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for listening. Do come back tomorrow for part 2.